inviting me. So I'd like to say thanks first and say that I'm going to be talking about the topic that is, of course, much broader than the time allotted, but I'm just going to cover some of the issues involved in the development of values and represent the issues, the relevant issues with evidence mainly from studies in my lab, but not necessarily a single study. So I will spare the methodological details in most cases. So let's start by the important definition of what we mean by values. And there is a very common definition that Schwartz developed, which is that values are desirable. I mean, that means they're always representing good ideas. They're abstract goals. We're not talking about something specific. We're talking about something that's abstract, intangible, and they serve as guiding principles for behavior in life. This is probably why we're most interested in them, because values can motivate behavior. They motivate how we think about others, how we think about ourselves. Importantly, values are organized based on compatibilities and conflicts in underlying motivations. I'll talk about that in a minute. And they're supposedly transsituational, meaning that they're relatively stable across time and consistent across situations. It's important to say that whereas a lot of research in philosophy, in sociology, talks about values as entities that are common to people in a certain context, for example, a culture, when we talk about values, we talk about psychological constructs that vary across individuals and often also across cultures. So values can be seen more as an aspect of personality rather than some philosophical entity that people can believe in or not, although they also exist as such as well, of course. A few questions that I'm going to be touching upon. First of all, can we talk about values in children? When do values emerge? How do we know that? Do values relate to meaningful behaviors and attitudes? That's why we're interested in values, because they are not just ideas, they are also relevant to what we do in the world. And I can already say that the relationship between values and behaviors is not straightforward, and that's why it's interesting and important to also look at the contextual constraints on the role of values in behavior. How do values develop? Do they maturate with age? In what direction do they age? Does it matter what age you are to know what values you value? And of course, perhaps the most interesting question with which I'm most interested in my own work is what accounts for individual variation in values. Culture, is it parenting? Maybe it's in our genes. I will present results from several studies to address these issues. And obviously, all of this will be just in a nutshell, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have later, but I'm not going to be talking about all of those topics in depth. So a bit about, I said that values represent motivations that are either in conflict or in harmony with each other, and this is a value structure that has been developed by Shalom Schwartz and tested in virtually any part of the world, including all continents, including different kinds of cultures, small scale, large scale, etc. Values represent a motivational continuum. There are many, many values, but they're organized into 10 values. In the modern refined version of the theory, these 10 values are also farther divided into 19. I'm not going to be talking about that. But they also represent a two-dimensional structure in the sense that there are two main dimensions. One of them contrasts conservation, which are the values of conservation of tradition, conformity, security. You have the definitions on the left, as compared to values of openness to change, including self-direction, which is autonomous thought and action, and stimulation, which is more about adventure and challenge. The other dimension is about self-transcendence, putting other people's interests before your own, as compared to self-enhancement, which is taking care of your own interests, including values of power and achievement. And interestingly, behaviors and demographics and attitudes and most variables that are correlated with this value structure tend to relate to it in ways that are coherent with the circular structure. For example, pro-social behavior or empathy have been related positively to the values of benevolence, universalism, and negatively to values of power. And all of the other values in between across the circle tend to correlate less strongly with pro-social behavior. I'll give an example or two later. Another interesting thing is that the few empirical longitudinal studies that have been done on values usually show that change also follows the circular logic. So if you become somebody who gives more importance to power, then usually this is accompanied by a drop in the importance of the opposed value of universalism, and vice versa. So development also follows this logic, and usually we can't hold two values that are on the opposite sides of a dimension, either conservation or openness to change, or self-transcendence and self-enhancement, as very, very important to the self. And this is an important part of the theory. And as I said, this has been supported in over 80 cultures with many different measures. And I think it's one of the most replicated findings in social science. When do values start to develop? If you open a developmental psychology book and you look for the word values in the index, they will always, or almost always, send you to the chapter on adolescence. And indeed, most of the research, there isn't much research on values in developmental journals. In developmental journals, we see that most of the research is on adolescence, indeed, which represents some ideas maybe following Erikson's identity crisis in adolescence and other issues that put the importance of adolescence into developing a coherent identity, which of course includes a sense of values. So this is why for many years, research on value development has focused on adolescence. But of course, there isn't a very good reason to expect values to somehow just emerge in adolescence. They are there, or at least partly there, even earlier. We have a self that children can think about already by the age of 3 or 4, including self-awareness. We have abstraction abilities. I'm preaching to the converted here. Of course, you know that better than me. The children's abstraction abilities are already already there, enabling children to think about stuff in categories and to use abstraction to coordinate concepts. And this is important for a value structure. So we have this. We have the ability to evaluate others. Some research, even for example, by Kylie Hamlin, talks about the first year of life, the ability to evaluate. So all of those components are there, making us, in theory, able to think about values and to organize values in our system. And all that was needed was a good measure, and Anna Doring came up with a measure. Some of you already know this one. And this measure tried to, Anna came with the idea that, of course, we can't expect children to think about values like we think about them in adulthood, abstract concepts. Obviously, we have to put it a little bit down. And she came up with these cartoons, and the cartoons represent a value. For example, to be rich and powerful represents power values. To relax represents hedonism values, and so on. The children get these cartoons, and they have to rate them, to rank them. And in our version of the measure, they do it twice. And eventually, we can get numerical scores of the values based on this procedure that is really easy for children. They do it, it's only 5 levels of importance. They find it pretty easy to do and pretty enjoyable as well. And what we get when we use this data is that we get a structure that represents the Schwartz value circle almost perfectly. This is a 5-year-old study from the Science Museum in Jerusalem. These were 60 kids, and you get an almost perfect structure that represents the Schwartz structure almost perfectly. So age 5. So of course, these are Science Museum visitors, so maybe not your typical 5-year-old, but we already see something very meaningful, and we replicate that with a community sample of children, not museum goers, by the age of 5 or 6 or 7. So something really strong happens there. That doesn't mean that everything is over by the age of 5. There's still much development going on. For example, this is a Polish study by Jan Czechik, and he used the same measure, and he shows that 1-year rank order stability correlations increase with age, peaking around age 8-9. They're very low at the age of 7. So the prediction from age 7 to 8 is pretty low for some of the values. But at the age of 12, we already have predictions of 0.4, 0.5, which is lower than adults, but not much lower than what you would find with adults. Similarly, if we look at consistency in values, this is another measure of values developed by the Australian team of Julie Lee and colleagues. We see that children's consistency in choices of what is important to them or not increases with age, whereas the 5-year-olds are much less consistent. If the benchmark here is about 80%, then we only have 4% who are 40% who are consistent, whereas by the age of 10, we already have a very high level of consistency. So there is a protracted developmental process that takes place during childhood. And finally, another example, this is from my lab. These are 5 to 7-year-old children. And here, Adi Zivel, a master student in my lab, had this brilliant idea to look at children's executive functions and see how that related to how they think about their values. And specifically here, we look at switching ability. And what we see is that on the right, with the children with high switching ability, we have a perfect Schwartz structure. These are 5 to 7-year-old children. Whereas on the left, with the low switching ability, we have a pretty bad structure, such that self-enhancement and self-transcendence, supposedly opposed to each other, are on the same side, same with conservation and openness to change. So the main distinctions of the structure are not there. So something about executive functions enables children to think more abstractly, to organize their preferences, and that develops during this age. And so this is when we say that 5-year-old children have a structure, that means that on average they do. But some children are still not mature enough to have a very good structure, and this is what we see on the left. But we do know that these values are meaningful, even at the younger ages. For example, when you give children the opportunity to share candy with another child, this is, I'm just going to go over it very quickly. So this is chocolate coins, a very, very meaningful material for children, and we let them divide the value, the coins between themselves and another child who is not present at the point. And what we see is that children's values are related to how much they donate. For example, this is from one study, the same one I showed earlier, sorry. And what we see here is that for the more generous children, we find a very strong difference between self-transcendence and self-enhancement values, whereas for the less generous children, still self-transcendence values are important, but much less so. So we see a connection between the values of children and whether they behave generously or not. This is important. It's the first, the youngest study where we did this, but we can look at constraints. For example, if we let children do the same behavior, but this time with no cost. In this case, we interpret a no-cost donation. It's like here on the right, you get nothing, but you can prevent the other person from getting one, or you get just the one, and you can prevent the other person from getting one. Here, there is a very strong norm for giving to the other person because it's costless. What we find is that in this case, children's values are not relevant to their behavior. So costless sharing is almost unrelated to values, which tells us that values become more important when there is not a strong norm. In another study, we find that sharing candy, in this case, with an unfamiliar peer is related to children's values in the same ways that we thought. Universalism positively and power negatively. However, sharing with a friend here in orange is unrelated to values. So you share with your friend because it's a friend, not because of your specific values. There's a very strong norm that should be sharing with your friend. And here's another study. These are adolescents, actually. And we look at the association between power values and violence at school. And in some schools, there's a very strong norm against violence. This is the white line. and there's a very low level of violence. And what we find here is that in these kind of schools, values are almost irrelevant to behavior, whereas in the schools with higher levels of violence, where there is no strong norm against violence, we find a pretty substantial prediction from values to behavior. So values are relevant to behavior more strongly in a weak norm context. Am I going too fast? If I am, please somehow find a way to let me know. What about, so we see that value development is protracted. We see that it's still going on throughout adolescence, throughout childhood. And I also say that also throughout adolescence, even though this is not the main part of the talk. Let's see what happens with priorities. So this is data from our twin study, and we had children tested at age 7 and at age 13, 9 and 11. And this is just the importance, the mean importance across children. And what we find, it is a very typical finding that benevolence is the most important value, and it's very important at age 7. It's also the second most important at age 13, even though hedonism goes up, might have to do with pubertal processes, I don't know. Power is pretty low in importance at the age of 7. And we can see that there are important changes. For example, security goes down, tradition goes substantially down, conformity, the conservative values become weaker with age. This is interesting because when we look at adults, what we find is that adults on average become more conservative with age, not less conservative with age. So the younger child is more conservative than the older child or the pre-adolescent child. This is an interesting finding. Whereas, of course, values of openness to change, such as stimulation here, go up in importance, self-direction goes up in importance, and so on. So openness becomes more important as children grow up, and self-transcendence and conservation goes down in importance as children grow up. I have to say that this is interesting, but this is also, we have to look at it also cross-culturally. This is why I was so excited of the possibility to look at value development within the culture of schooling study. Because what does it mean that children become higher on benevolence or lower on conformity? Does it mean that there is a developmental task that makes them give more importance or less importance to this value? Or maybe these are the cultural norms about what is important, what should be important in a society. So is it about Israel being a society where security is important, so children give it high importance, or that power becomes more important, or achievement, and that's why it goes up with age, as children are increasingly socialized into society? Or is it that adolescence enables children, requires children to increase the importance of achievement because it's an increasingly achievement-oriented developmental period, adolescence as compared to middle childhood? So for that, we need a cross-cultural study. There aren't many cross-cultural studies on children's values. There's maybe 2 or 3 that are, multicultural. I'm not talking about two cultures only. In one of them, this is a study that I did with Ela Daniel and Klaus Benke and other colleagues. And we looked at the importance of values in 6 different groups in Israel and Germany. They were either Israeli or German majority, or Russians, or Arabs in Israel, or Turkish. So we have a Christian group, a Jewish group, a Muslim group in both countries. The Israeli Russians are part Jewish, part Christian. And what we find is that the overall tendency for power values, this is just an example, increases with age. So across, and this replicates what we found with the twin study. So values of power become increasingly important, even though there seems to be a drop from 14 to 15 to 16 and 17. But there's also an interaction with age. So for example, in this case, we see that the Israeli majority goes down in the importance of power and then goes up. So culture also has a constraint on how important values become with age. The same issue of specificity and commonality can be seen here in the universalism values. Here again, we have an interaction with culture. So on average, children give a reduced importance to universalism values, which are about acceptance and tolerance of others. As they grow up, however, this reduction in importance is not the same rate across cultures. And this is something we're working on today to try to understand the specifics of development. How much of it how much of a cultural development of values is specific to cultures and how much of it is, I don't want to say universal, it's just 6 cultures, but it's generalizable across these very different cultures. So we can also ask many other questions about culture and values. For example, do cultures vary in the values that are available? This is not so much covered by the Schwartz theory, but it's an important question that could be asked. Are values structured similarly across cultures? We know that the answer is yes. That has been shown repeatedly with dozens of studies. The hierarchy of values. So on average, benevolence is rated high across cultures, but it's not always the most important, and it varies across cultures and so on. We don't know what causes mean difference across cultures in values. So we have this explanation that children learn the values of their culture, and that's why they become different in their values as they grow up. But that's not an explanation, it's just a description. We don't know how this happens. Of course, there's a lot of anthropological and sociological theory on that, but at least I am not aware of a very good developmental study that showed how these processes takes place. Not to mention the fact that we don't know when these cultural differences emerge. So here we saw that same effects are here at the age of 11 and at the age of 17. It's almost the same effect size of the variation across cultures. And this means that by the age of 11, they're already different. So when did they become different in their values, these children? It would be interesting to do a study with younger children to find out. Of course, there are many methodological and other constraints. I'm not going to be talking about them, but you already have them in mind now that I'm talking, I'm sure. It's just an opening for a discussion, I think. Another way to look at it is to ask, where do individual differences in values come from? And here I did something that is wrong. I just put several studies together in the same figure just to give you an example of how these things look. So age, sex, and country are from a multicultural study by Shalom Schwartz and Tammy Rubel with adults. And we see that the country is important to individual differences in values, but not that important. They had they had over 100 samples, and on average, across different kinds of measures and samples, no value was accounted for by more than 25% by culture, by country. The country was a cultural unit, which is of course debatable, and you could also look at smaller cultural units, of course. Age was important, but not that important. They looked at linear age, if I remember correctly, and sex differences were hardly important, although they were very consistent. So there was a female advantage on benevolence, universalism, and a male advantage on achievement power, which was consistent and found in maybe 120 out of 127 samples, but the effect sizes were very small, as you can see here. This is the part in blue. In orange, you will find the effects of schools. So this is another study that we did in Israel with 30 something Arab and Jewish schools in Israel. These are adolescents, and controlling for ethnicity, we still find that which school you go to is associated with what kind of values you have. And in this case, school accounted for 5 to 10% of the variance in values, depending on what value we're talking about. It was the most important for tradition, universalism, and least important for stimulation. And finally, if we look at parents, we can see that parents and children are substantially correlated in their values. This is something that has been shown many, many times, and much more strongly for tradition values, and this has also been shown in other opportunities. But of course, we have to remember that parents and children share the values for many, many different reasons, starting from socialization to sharing an eco-cultural niche to even genetic tendencies that might be shared between parents and children. Let me give you just one example of the school effect. This is data from the twin study, and here we know what school they go to, and we know whether they go to a religious school and a non-religious school. In Israel, most Jewish schools are either considered religious or non-religious, so they have this sign. There are different parts of the ministry takes care of them, and so on. And we can see some generalities and some commonalities and some differences. So for example, benevolence is the most important value for both kinds of schools, for children in both kinds of schools, and power is the least important value for both kinds of schools. But tradition, which is very low in the non-religious schools, is pretty high in the religious schools, whereas hedonism is it's substantially higher, important for the non-religious kids from the non-religious schools and so on. And achievement also is more important for the kids from the non-religious schools. So whether you go to this school or that school is eventually related to what kind of values you have. And I have to say that this is also related to the values in the household. So we have to think about this as a system where the household and the school are related to each other. So for example, if we add to the regression where we try to distinguish between children based on their school religiosity, in what values they have, if we add family religiosity, this accounts for the whole effect of school. So it's actually the same effect, at least in Israel, where the schools are separated to religious and non-religious. The prediction of what school you'll go to is based on what family you're from, and that affects what values you'll be exposed to at school, and that affects what values you're going to have. So we have to think about it as a system of influences rather than whether it's the family or the school. It's both, and they reinforce each other, if you wish. And finally, I said something about genetics. I know this is not something very common, but this is from a recent review paper that Louise Twitter and I wrote. And we just looked at all of the published papers on values in twin studies. There weren't too many. And what we find is that across studies, and in most cases, monozygotic twins who are genetically identical are more strongly correlated than dizygotic twins who are only 50% on average genetically related. And that provides evidence for a genetic resemblance in values. So part of what happens that makes children similar to the values of their parents in their values to their parents has to do with sharing the genes between the generations. And we can put it in some sort of a model where we look at parental values and children's values, trying to figure out why they are similar to each other. And of course, we have the parental influence, which would be the classical socialization model. We have the shared environmental value antecedent, such as whether they are in this neighborhood or that neighborhood, this ethnicity or that ethnicity, and so on. We also have the shared genetic value antecedent, because in most families, parents and children are genetically related to each other. If values have a genetic component as gleaned from the twin correlations, then that would mean that part of why parents and children have similar values has to do with their shared genetic heritage. And one final thing that I didn't talk about, but might be important, is that some of the coordination in values between parents and children might reflect actually the effect of children on their parents. So this is something that has hardly been studied, but if you have children, you know that they sometimes have their way, and you sometimes think about your values from a new perspective when they say what they think or want. And so there is no reason to deny the possibility that children's values affect parental values, but that has been hardly studied, as I said. Let me just conclude. Children have values, not only adolescents, children have values, and these values are based on motivational compatibilities and conflicts that are very similar to those of adults. However, this is a protracted process where values become increasingly stable and consistent across time. I have to say that in another line of work, we show that actually values can become less consistent across time. But this is when children think about their values in different contexts. So I didn't have the time to talk about this, but when we ask children to think about their values in different contexts, for example, myself as an Israeli and as a Russian immigrant, if I were, then the older children are more able to do this distinction. So in one way, values become increasingly consistent, but they also become increasingly complex. As children grow up, this takes place especially in adolescence, and we've shown it with regards to ethnic identity, but also with other aspects of identity, such as my values as a family member or as a student in my school. Values may serve as guiding principles for behavior. One thing I didn't say much is that values are used for evaluating others. So when I think about somebody and I know how they behave, my values help me think about whether that behavior was good or not, and whether I like them or not, maybe whether I'll vote for them or not. This is a very nice line of work by Caprara in Italy, for example. And also, another important aspect of evaluation is that values can be used to evaluate the self. If I'm doing stuff that is against my own values, I might feel bad about myself, and my measurement for what is good or not in what I did is my values, actually. But whether values translate directly to behavior, as you saw, the relationships are not that strong, and they are constrained by contextual demands. So, for example, when there's a strong norm, values are less important. And one thing that I didn't say, but has been shown in a couple of papers, not too many, is that values become increasingly stronger guides for behavior as children grow up. So some of the work that has looked at the association between values and behavior shows that these associations become stronger the older children are, which might have to do with values becoming increasingly stable and consistent, but also it might have to be with children's ability to link the behavior, the right behavior, to the values that they value. And I think that's about it. Thank you to my students and my funders, and of course to you.
Thank you so much for that talk. It was fascinating on many, many different levels. Questions? Well, I've got some. Oh, sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Ariel. This is not a super familiar area of research for me. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
This is not a super familiar area of research for me, but partly because of the COS program, I've gotten much more interested in this work, even though it's been in the background of social psychology or the foreground sometimes for many years. I wrote down some questions while you were talking, and then your last slide pretty much anticipated all of my questions, and so you beat me to it. But I'm curious, what is the strongest evidence from your perspective that these values and systems of values are causally important, given that most of this research, as you've already said, is correlational in nature?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's a great question, and I have to say that there have been many attempts to look at the causality of the values to behavior effect. So, for example, there is a nice line of work by Gregory Mayo in Cardiff. No, it's not in Cardiff anymore, but in the UK, where values are primed, and then when people think about their values, then they're more likely to behave based on their values. So this is experimental evidence. When it comes to day-to-day variability in values, I'm not so sure. I think this is something that still has to be researched more deeply. Whether we use values, some people say that values are chronically accessible, so that we have these values there when we make an important decision, or maybe not such an important decision, and they are represented in what we do, and the correlations are supposedly showing that. Other people say that this is more true for behaviors that are, for example, costly, or important. So whether I'm going to vote this candidate or that candidate, if that's important to me, then I'm going to be using my values more strongly than if I'm not that interested. I think it's still an open question. And I also want to say that I'm not so sure about the causality in the developmental sense. So I'm not so sure that values are there and then behaviors are there, because many of the behaviors that we predict with values emerge before. So, for example, we have variability in aggression that is predicted by values, and all of the studies that did this in adolescence. But of course, children show aggression at a much, much earlier age, and there are stable individual differences in aggression before we can really talk about children having values. So at least in younger ages, if anything, the causality is not there. Maybe it's even the opposite causality. But that doesn't mean that at a later age, we don't have values that are ready, organized, and accessible so that we can use them for behavior, for an important behavior at least, decision at least, yeah.
Thank you. And you said that was Gregory Mayo from the UK for the
From
priming
the UK,
study,
yeah.
is that right?
Yeah, Mayo
Yeah,
with an
okay,
I,
thank you.
M-A-I-O.
Ah, okay, thank you.
I was wondering about the interaction between norms and values, which is really fascinating on many different levels. And I'm very sympathetic to your point that this is a systems level problem, or not a problem, but there are many, many different factors that are going to influence behavior. Values would be one of them. And I was curious about, and there's probably not experimental work on this, but your thoughts on what happens when the stated values of a population concerning maybe creativity or low conformity, individualism, for example, the stated values are not reinforced in practices in some cultural institutions. For example, the schooling, where in the US context, there's lots of emphasis on lack of low conformity and individualism and creativity and kind of going your own way, that sort of thing. And our schools are, in many cases, not reinforcing that, right? They're reinforcing just the opposite, where it's very much about following the rules, and it's a very kind of hierarchical structure. And there are, in fact, penalties associated with not following rules and not conforming. So I was curious about, well, your thoughts on that and how we might understand that a little bit more. I mean, this is true, I think, even in schools where you ask teachers and parents, they would profess these values are important. But again, the structures may not be, I think, are probably in many cases not reinforcing that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that this is a problem. I don't know if there's a way around it. I'll say, for example, this is not about schools, but we did a study on parents and children, and we asked adolescents to rate parents' behavior, parents' values based on what they said and what they did. And what we found was that there was a very strong negative correlation between the discrepancy between what parents said and what they did, and whether children say, I want to be like my father, I identify with my father, because before I make an important decision, I try to think what my mother would say, and so on. So children pick up on that, and they don't like it. And we never asked, is your father a hypocrite? But I think this has to do with it. So I think when we actually, I had a similar discussion today. We went to visit the Ministry of Education here in Jerusalem, and we spoke to their research people, and they say that they raised the same issue, and they said, okay, so the school principal has these very nice values, but then she has to take care of COVID issues, and half of the children are at home, in confinement or whatever, and she doesn't have the time to talk about intellectual development, autonomy, and all of those nice values. So I think eventually, when we look at values, especially at the systems level, it will be very important to look at the discrepancies. I don't know if there's a good way to do this, but I think we'll have to keep in mind that what people think their values are not necessarily what their values are totally. I mean, there's got to be some very important gap between these two systems, and worth thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Why not?
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. And I have a question. I'm sort of wondering, I've been trying to figure out how to phrase this best, but I just wondering if maybe this is more of a dynamic relationship of different factors. So like what I'm thinking is that in certain scenarios, the genetic or the socialization factors will be stronger, whereas in others, more environmental factors. So maybe it's better if I give an example. I'm thinking of children who are maybe adopted from completely different cultures and probably different parental values. Children who are first generation immigrants and they grew up in a very different cultural value of their, like the country they are growing up in, whereas their parents probably are having maybe opposing or different values. And I'm wondering if that is something that you may be considered, if this is not something that, oh, this is how much we can predict by genetic, this is how much we can predict by schooling, but it's more of a dynamic thing and it will vary based on the scenario and how different these factors are in a given individual's like experience.
Great question. I'm afraid I don't know of any good adoption study on values, but I would say, I would bet that this would be a very interesting take on the topic. I'm sure, I mean, if anything, it's about complexity, right? So the genetics are just there as, as a starting point, but you have socialization on top of them, and you have all of the interactions trying to get to an outcome of what values are. But if you think about twins, for example, if you think about even identical twins, they're not 100% correlated. You saw the correlations. They are maybe 0.50 correlated, which is pretty low if you think about it, for people who have the same household and grew up with the same parents, with the same ethnicity and the same culture and the same history, and so on. So there's a lot of noise that we don't know, and I don't think it's all necessarily about measurement. I think there's a lot of noise that has to do with many other aspects of socialization that we are not aware of. They could be the media, they could be many other things, and all of those come together. The fact that the monozygotic twins are substantially more strongly correlated tells us that at least some of it has to do with genetics, but that also just gives a beginning. A beginning for this process. It's a starting point, because the same socialization would be different depending on what child this is. The same parents socialize two very different children, but if you took, as you said in our example, if you took the same children and grew them up in another society, they would probably develop different values. We don't know why, but they will.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Oh, actually, I do have one. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
This is very much in line of like my interest also, so I'm really curious. And the other thing that I was wondering if you ever thought of, or if you know of any research that has tested the same individuals, but maybe those who are bilingual or multilingual and on different languages, and whether the values shift slightly when they use a different language.
I think it's a fascinating topic. We have bilingual individuals. Of course, the immigrant samples that I mentioned earlier are all bilingual. They speak Russian at home and Hebrew at school, for example, in the case of Israelis. And I know from research on social identity that switching the language or other cultural primes could affect how you think about yourself in terms of identity and how you behave and so on. So that would be a very nice line of work. I'm not sure if anybody did it, and if not, it would be a great idea for research.
It reminds me of one of the group-specific studies. He's kind of focally interested in how the language that you're speaking influences not just values, but as you point out, identity and things of that sort. I was wondering if you had, or if you knew of any data sets that looked at generational change in values.
Yeah, there are a few, mainly American studies that look at generational change in values. There's also the Word Value Survey that looks at at adults. All of those with adults.
Okay, and these are cross-sectional, I would assume.
The Word Value Survey is cross-sectional. Yeah. Yeah, maybe you have some multi-generational studies such as grandparents, parents and children. Vern Bengtson did that, but I'm not sure if there's more.
I just have a question about measuring values that follows on Christine's question, but also your comment about talking to some people at one of the educational ministries or institutions there. Does it make sense to say that organizations have values? I mean, many of them claim to have values that probably map onto a lot of the dimensions that are here in the Schwartz framework. Do you think that actually is, I mean, do you think that that actually makes sense to look at this at an organizational level? It seems to be happening in the family. And if so, you know, I'm thinking about the schools that I'm going into for, and I'll be going into multiple schools for this project. You know, is there an efficient way of measuring that, or are we not quite there yet?
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot of work mainly in you know, in business or organizational behavior that looks at organizational values. I'm not very familiar with the topic when it comes to schools. I know, for example, that we have a paper where we looked at the aggregate of the values of children in the school, and we saw that this, and we also had teachers, and we saw that the aggregate of parents of children and the aggregate of students were correlated with each other. So this might be a way to look at the values of the organization. There's another study by Shaul Oreg and Yair Berzon, also from Israel, and they looked at the school principals' values, and they show that this predicts change in students' values. So you could take the school principal as an indicator of what values the school stands for, and that's been published in Psych Science a few years ago. But to be honest, I think the principles cannot be the whole story. I think the principles are important, but there are also, you know, the structure of the school, even, I don't know, what's there on the signs in the you know, in the hall could be different. There are many ways that children are exposed to values and to, you know, more specific, more how do you say that, implicit or explicit. I think it's a fascinating topic. I'm not too familiar with it, so I won't say more.
Other questions? I think Mark, just commenting on your question, I think it's also worth considering disconnect between just like the schools, what is officially professed as part of an organizational's values and what is actually reinforced. And I'm sure people working for all kinds of companies and organizations, including universities, point out that maybe what they they claim to value might not be what they are, you know, rewarding people for or actively socializing. So really interesting. Not that there's all, you know, complete disconnect. There's probably going to be a lot of convergence there, as well as things like how explicit organizations are about values, right? Is this something that they're like, by the way, this is what our values are? Or is this an explicit process? Is it much more implicit? Does that matter? Because of course we can learn through implicit messages all the time, right? It doesn't have to be explicit, but just the extent to which a company or an organization goes out of their way to say, by the way, this is our list of values. And does that have an impact on individual employees or group members or children or whatever? But I love the idea of studying this at the group level and different people in hierarchies within groups as well.
Yeah, it sounds a bit daunting. It's you know, probably not something I would take up like without a template, but I would be likewise, I would love to see somebody developing a kind of somewhat efficient system of measuring organizational values in a way that goes beyond, you know, what they claim, and as Ariel said, what one particular leader or CEO or something, someone is promoting.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? All right, well, that was absolutely fascinating. Just the overview was incredibly useful for the project, as well as all of these empirical studies, which will be really useful as we collect values data as part of this project in all of our different sites and core methods. One thing I want to mention, I think Adrian, you posted in the chat that we're looking for signups for future talks. There's a link to sign up there. So please let us know who would like to present next. This is of course recorded and will be available to all those who were unable to attend live. So the whole team will have access, which is great. All right, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Ariel. I really enjoyed that talk.
Thank you.